Previously, on the White Dog Garage YouTube channel, we showed you a video on the tools, spares and tips for caravan travel in the outback. But in this episode, we return our attention back to servicing the front end on the 1980 to 85 Suzuki 16-valve 1100cc motorbikes. After servicing the steering stem and forks in part 1 of this series, we are ready to move on.
Welcome back, viewers. In this episode we're servicing the front brakes. The brakes are the same on both the road bike and the sports bike. I've already checked and the front brake pads and the discs are all within specification, all in good shape. All we need to do is do a little bit of lubrication. Now you're probably thinking, do we ever lubricate brakes? Well, we do. Stay tuned and I'll show you what we do with disc brakes.
But first, Bob needs to put the front end back together, and once again we are showing you this for the Katana. Bob first fits the speedometer tachometer unit. After he finishes the front end, he will move to the motor, for which he will then remove the fairing frame. I cannot help thinking he should have removed it with the panel work, so he would have had easier access to the front end.
Good point. The reason I did not remove it before starting on the front end is storage space. The Katana actually sat on the lift table for about 6 weeks as I fitted it in between other jobs. Knowing this is often the case with my bike work, I usually only take off the bare essentials so that the parts don't become lost or damaged in storage.
Next, Bob fits the front mudguard. 4 bolts hold it on, 2 on each side. He has to juggle these bolts through the brake hose brackets, steering brace and mudguard to reach the fork slider. Having got one side in place, he can let go of the mudguard and bolt up the second side.
Every time you have a wheel out, you should check the bearings. The front has sealed ball races on each side, and I rotate them with my finger, feeling for a smooth movement with no notchiness. The brake hose brackets will foul the tyre edges, but being rubber, it's just a matter of forcing the wheel past them. I then adjust the height of the jack to align the fork with the wheel's axle position. I then fit the speedometer drive to its engagement slots on the left hand side of the wheel and the spacer to the right hand side before juggling the wheel with speedometer drive and spacer into position. And yes, it's a tight fit. Then in goes the axle and the axle nut, which I will leave loose for the moment.
Before connecting the speedometer cable, Bob spins the front wheel to check that the drive has properly engaged, before running the cable up to the speedometer. The Katana cable shown here has a longer screw-on end than the one for the road bike.
We're now going to work on the brakes. The brakes have got a little habit of sticking on a bit they're not really sticking on, dragging. My provisional diagnosis is that the sliders are probably gummed up. I don't think it's a case of the pistons getting stuck, and working on that basis I'm going to give it a clean, and at this time I would always re-grease the sliders and hopefully that'll sort it out. So I've been through my spares box and I've picked out a few items to just give you more detail on the action and what we would call the lubrication points on the front brakes. This is known as a pad carrier in Suzuki terminology. The disc pads sit on these shoulders here, and the disc runs through the middle there, and there's a pad on either side. It's also just known as the caliper bracket. This is the actual brake caliper, and probably something I need to point out at this point in time is that in these bikes there are Pacific left and right pad carriers and calipers. So this is a left-hand one, and you know that because there's an L there, and this is a right-hand one, and you know that because there is an R there that tells you it's the right-hand unit. There's just a subtle difference in orientation. Now, the caliper itself has inside of it a piston. When the brakes are applied, hydraulic fluid is added to the inside there, and that forces the piston out. There's a pad on each side, and the piston acts to clamp one pad against the other, and the disc is in the middle, so effectively the force is transferred to the disc, which then stops the bike. There's only one piston in this one, and it's what's known as a single piston or single action caliper or disc brakes. The issue with the pad on each side is the disc is running in the middle. There is a subtle movement every time the brakes are applied. Now, if it was rigidly mounted, the disc would merely be dragged to one side and would eventually, under hard braking, warp. To prevent this, the caliper actually floats on the mounting bracket or pad carrier. So the caliper sits essentially like this in the bracket or pad carrier, and its action is it has to be able to move within or across the pad carrier. How this is done is these bolts, which are called slider bolts, or in Suzuki terminology they are caliper axle bolts. There's one on each side. They're held in place by a slider nut, and it's got a flat edge on one side which goes against the body of the caliper, and when you do it up it's held in place. And the caliper sits in the bracket like so, and it's able to move in and out within that range of movement. It is free to move, but it can't be dislodged because the disc itself is running between all of the assembly, and the disc would have to disintegrate for it to fly out to the side, or one of the pins disintegrate to enable it to just come off. What happens here is the slider bolt or axle bolt, caliper axle bolt, is going in there and it's moving in and out. So we're talking about lubrication now. We need to lubricate in there and in there, lubricate the slider bolt so that it moves smoothly in and out. You can use silicone grease for this. I actually use rubber grease because to stop dirt and grit getting in the caliper bolt, the slider bolt, there is a recess around here. There is a rubber boot that fits over that recess and has its own little mushroom area here. There's a recess here within the slider unit, and the shoulder of that rubber boot is forced into that recess and holds it in place. And that gives you lubrication protection from any water or dirt that might want to enter. As I said before, the pads sit on these shoulders here, and to protect those shoulders, because it is aluminium, there is an end bracket that goes over, sits like that, and we need to apply some lubrication here and here so that the pad action is relatively smooth. Likewise on the end bracket, which is missing here but would go there. What I use for that purpose is copper grease. It's a very, very high temperature grease. It won't melt or liquefy to get onto the disc, but a small smudge of copper grease on those surfaces, the contact surfaces for the pads. Now, within the caliper, there is what's known as the pad spring, and there are contact surfaces there, and these also get lubricated with just a fine smear of copper grease. Not shown here, but there is normally a plate that sits in there. It has little spring clips that holds it within the piston, and I put a little smear of grease on there as well, and the pad actually sits against that plate. And then on these legs here, I would normally put a little smear of grease as well, the finest smear, and there's another pad that sits across there.
Here Bob refits the brake unit to the front fork so that he can remove the caliper from its holder, which he does by undoing and taking out the slider pins. Hanging the caliper up on the hook, he carefully removes the disc pads, making sure to lay them down in the same position as they sat in the holder. It is important to do this because the wear pattern on the pads is unique to their position in the holder, and they must be replaced in exactly the same position. He then removes the holder from the forks for cleaning.
Here I have gathered up the caliper holder or pad carrier, the two slider pins and their slider nuts with their rubber boots still attached for cleaning. My choice of cleaning solvent is kerosene, which I use with a brush to clean off all the old grease, brake dust and grime from the bracket and the slider pins. Be careful what you use for cleaning. Some solvents will destroy the rubber boots. Then I cleaned the caliper. Here I used a water-soluble degreaser, which will not harm the rubber dust boot on the caliper piston. Washing it clean with water afterwards.
Bob is now lubricating the slider pins and their cylinders with rubber grease. You could also use silicone grease. Use just enough grease to lubricate the action, as too much could cause a hydraulic lock, limiting your braking power, or be forced out past the rubber boot to contaminate the brake pads. He then fits slider nuts with attached rubber boots to the caliper. With the boots attached to the caliper, he then inserts the slider pins into their respective cylinders and moves them in and out to ensure their surface is lubricated and any excess grease has been forced out before the pins are bolted in place.
With the fresh grease in place for the slider pins or caliper axle bolts, I move to lubricating the pad action. For this, I am using a copper grease. I start by lubricating the surface of the two end plates that the pads sit on in the pad carrier or caliper holder. Just a smear of grease is all that is required.
Bob then bolts the pad carrier back onto the forks. After this, he refits the brake pads in the same positions they were in before their removal. He then turns his attention to the caliper, applying copper grease to the piston plate and pad spring contact areas before inserting the caliper into the caliper holder, after which he inserts and tightens up the slider pins to hold the caliper in place. This would be the extent of the brake lubrication on the earlier street bikes, but the Katana has an anti-dive system which is also attached to the caliper by a second brake line.
With the caliper bolted down, I reattach the anti-dive actuator to the anti-dive unit on the front of the fork and screw it down. Before fitting the actuator, I apply some rubber grease to the inside. This provides some protection for the rubber seals and helps to keep moisture and thus corrosion at bay. The bolt for this bike's caliper bracket need to be safety wired, which I then did. Safety wiring for these bolts is not standard on the Suzuki range. This is an aftermarket modification.
With the brakes on both sides serviced, Bob spins the front wheel, fully applies the front brake and holding it on, tightens up the axle nut. That is it for the front end. The steering stem, forks and brakes have been done, and it is time to move on to the motor, which will feature in a future episode.
Thanks again for watching, and tune in next month for another episode on the White Dog Garage YouTube channel. Bye.